Alright guys, it's time to talk about the most important part, the mana base. Turns out you can't play any of these spells without having the correct mana. So I've got a few lists pulled up here. The first one, third place, Card Kingdom Modern 1K. You're going to see some very similar strategies with the mana base, some with a few more man lands than others. For those of you that don't understand what manlands are, they are lands that can turn into creatures or your win cons. Alright, first we're going to go over Blackcleave Cliffs. This is basically one of the best lands for this deck. You're getting to cast your turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 1 Inquisition of Kozilek, rather easily than having to shock and fetch in, usually leaving yourself around the 15 life mark before you pass to your opponent. So very, very important part of the deck, and as we can see, the price has been climbing for that very reason. Next part we're going to get to is Shocklands. Something that's kind of the bread and butter of most modern decks since we can't use the original duels. This guy went with 1 Blood Crypt, 1 Stomping Ground, and where seems that he has not went. Okay, here's 1 Overgrown Tomb. So he's went pretty light on his Shocklands. 1 of Orborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, being able to turn your basics into basically revised duels is pretty handy. Turning your forest into an Overgrown Tomb is pretty handy. I would not recommend going over 1. It being a legendary land, you're gonna run into trouble of getting multiples in your opening hand and having to sack off a land just so you can get further into the game. And next we're gonna get to fetches. This guy has chose to run 2 Bloodstained Mires, 4 Vernant Catacombs, because that's basically the core of this deck. It's basically the rock, or those of you that aren't familiar with the rock, it's a black-green shell, very dependent on disruption. And it looks like they've mainly added red here for probably the best card in Modern. But anyways, getting back to the mana base. 24 lands is pretty common. We'll check some of these others. 24, also 24. So that's basically the go-to for this particular deck or archetype. As you can see, some people prefer Raging Ravine. I personally like Treetop Village, but this card can be a really solid win con after you've gotten your opponent disrupted out in top deck mode, which is pretty easy with this deck. Alright, as you can see, Card Kingdom Modern 1K, second place. Pretty similar mana base. An MTGO Modern Constructed League first. Again, very similar. Looks like they've decided to add the Twilight Mire and a 1 of Ghost Quarter. Maybe the meta that they were looking to go against needed the turn 1 Ghost Quarter. This was probably during, let's see, what's the date on this? Yeah, I think Eldrazi was still a thing when this deck was created, so the 1 of Ghost Quarter was more than likely an addition for that deck. Not quite needed as much these days, but still really good if your meta is filled with a lot of Tron and other decks that are similar to that. Alright, Now let's get down to the fun cards. Disruption. These are not going to differ very much from each list. You pretty much have your go-to. I am a big fan of 4 Inquisition of Kozilek and 2 Thoughtseize, with the other 2 Thoughtseize in the board. But as you can see, this person has went to go with 3 and 3. Still comes out to 6 turn 1. Disruption. Just your preference. We're going to check this guy. 3 and 1. And 4 and 2. This guy seems to build a little closer to what I'm used to. Alright, so basically what these cards are going to do for you. Turn 1, Inquisition of Kozilek. No downside. You're going to be able to rip your probably their turn 1, turn 2, turn 3 drop. Really put them behind at least a turn, hopefully. Thoughtseize, pretty much the same thing. You're going to lose 2 life, but the amount of cards that you're going to be able to choose from is much higher, whereas Inquisition, you can only choose cards with a CC of 3 or less. Thoughtseize, you can nab anything that is not a land at the cost of 2 life. Alright, on to our other turn 1 spells. Lightning Bolt, more than likely not just going to be slinging it at your opponent on turn 1. This is going to be a very cheap removal spell or a finisher. As I've said earlier in the video, this is probably the best card in Modern at the moment. And let's move on to a newer addition to the deck. Kolaghan's Command. 3 mana, instant speed, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Target player discards a card, destroy target artifact, or 2 damage to target creature or player. For this card's CC, it is absolutely bonkers. It disrupts affinity decks, the ability to remove an opponent's threat and get back one of your own threats since you don't really run that many in this style of deck. It just fits in so well. Looks like they went a 2 of in this build, 3 of in this build, and 2 of in this build. Now I won't say that it's good enough to run a 4 of, but it is definitely a solid 2 in my list. Alright, on to our next card. Abrupt Decay. This is most decks' nightmare. For 2 mana, you can hit anything that's 3 or less CC that is non-land, and this spell cannot be countered. This is huge for your Delver strategies, your control builds that are usually only going to have a couple of threats, and it can't be countered, so they really don't have many ways to deal with it. Solid 4 of in this list. I also run 4 in my own build. A 2 of in this guy's list. It looks like he's went for a few more creatures. Definitely a lot heavier creature package than I'm used to in Jund. And a 1 of in this guy's. Again, running a much heavier creature build. I think I usually only run 12 to 14 threats in my Jund list. But hey, if it works for you, works for you. Next card. Maelstrom Pulse. The only downside to this card is its sorcery speed. For 3 mana, you can't get much more power pound for pound. Destroying a target permanent and all other permanents with the same name really beat down token strategies. People that are running Goblin Guide, early red deck win strategies where they're going to just gang up on you with multiple threats. This single top deck can sometimes just win you the game. We've got a 1 of here. Looks like this guy has omitted it from his list. He's got it in the sideboard. And this guy here has just omitted it from his list altogether. Although I run 2 in my list, it's a little bit greedy. I really love the card personally. And come to our go-to removal spell. Terminate, instant speed, destroy target creature. It cannot be regenerated for a red and a black. This is pretty much the go-to removal spell for Jund, Grixis, anything that has red, black, and modern right now. This is the way to remove your opponent's threats. We got a 3 of in this list, 2 of in this list, and a 2 of in this list. Just a really, really strong card. And last but not least, Lily of the Veil. This card can win you games on its own, by itself. As you can see from the price tag, there's a reason everybody is running 4 in their Jund lists. She just does more work than any other card in this deck, in my opinion. At 3 mana, she usually comes out, makes your opponent sack off a creature, and if they don't immediately crash in and kill her the next turn, starts depleting their hand until she's gonna ult. Now, the +1 seems like it's going to be a hard thing to use in this deck because you have very few threats and you don't really have a way to generate cards other than Dark Confidant, which we'll get to a little bit later. Her +1 seems like it's going to put you in a bind, but it's much better than you would expect. Getting your opponent to top deck mode is what you really, really want to do with this build. You're going to top deck into one of your threats. It's probably going to be pound for pound better than any of the threats that you're going to see in most archetypes that are similar or aggro, which comes down to her -2. -2 to make your opponent sacrifice a creature is really, really good. I can't think of many bad things to say about her -2. You can use it on yourself if you think a Dark Confidant is going to kill you off next turn on a flip. Getting rid of hexproof creatures and things that can't be targeted on your opponent's board. Just all around good. We'll get down to her last ability here. Separate all permanents target player controls into 2 piles. That player sacrifices all permanents in the pile of his or her choice. Very rarely get to see this go off, but when it happens, it's usually just a concession. It's pretty strong. Alright, that pretty much sums it up for Disruption. Let's get into win cons. Alright, as I described earlier, Raging Ravine is probably going to be your go-to in a lot of the builds. As I say, I use Treetop Village in mine, a little cheaper activation cost so that I can keep mana open for the Disruption. This thing turns into a 3/3 that every time it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Once you get down to top decking mode and you get rid of all your opponent's threats, which you should be able to with this huge Disruption list, this thing's just going to tear your opponent apart. Alright, now into a little bit more of the bread and butter of the deck. Dark Confidant. This is your card generating engine. He often wins you games just off the ability to draw an extra disruption spell, keep your opponent's board clear, and just keep crashing away. Alright, and this is quite a newer addition to the deck, but Kalitas, Trader of Get. At 4 mana seems a little bit high for your Dark Confidant. You don't want to be flipping this guy too often, but it's only a 2 of. Not too bad, and the lifelink sure does come in handy. Turns out, when you've got a deck full of disruption and removal spells, you're going to be pumping out some 2/2 zombies quite often. Alright, one of my favorite cards in the deck, Scavenging Ooze. 2 for a 2/2. Exile any target card from a graveyard. If that was a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on him and gain 1 life. I can't tell you how many games I've won because of this card. And Tarmogoyf. Basically, your giant flavor text beat stick. He wins games. 2 mana for usually a 3/4 or a 4/5 is just phenomenal. Multiple decks in the format run him. As you can see, his price reflects that. And another kind of new addition to the deck, Tasigur the Golden Fang. 6 mana, 4/5, having Delve, usually playing this guy for 1 or 2 mana, and he's just another massive beat stick with an upside. At the end of your opponent's turn, you can activate him, maybe get you some removal or some disruption back. It turns out pretty decent. I like the 1/of. Let's check these other guys. Corsair Crewfix. A little bit older, in my opinion. I started to see Jund run these more last year when the card was really hot in Standard. 3 mana for a 2/4. Keeps him safe from the almighty lightning bolt. And turns out playing the top card of your library, if it's a land card, can help you thin through your deck and gain you a life as soon as you play it. Not bad. My big bomb that I usually run, Huntmaster of the Fells. I've not yet converted to the Kalitas, however you would like to pronounce his name. This guy, for 4 mana, gets you a 2/2 that immediately puts a 2/2 green wolf creature token on the battlefield and gains you 2 life. If your opponent does not play a spell next turn, he flips into a 4/4 trample that deals 2 damage to one of their creatures and the opponent itself. This guy can dance his way back and forth to wins. Kitchen Finks. I can't say too much about this guy. He's just pound for pound. 3 mana, 3/2, gain 2 life when he comes in. When he dies, you're going to get 2 more life and have a persistent threat to keep bashing. Hence, persist. That looks like the majority of... Oh, we've got Olivia Voldaren. And this is a much older strategy. Jund was really pushing this maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago when Innistrad was hot. You still see the occasional 1/of. 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer is quite strong. She has the ability to pick off your opponent's creatures, and even in the late game, start taking control of them. She is definitely one threat to not take lightly. Alright, that pretty much sums it up. Wait, I forgot sideboards. Alright, here we go. Jund. Ancient Grudge. Turns out, if your opponent is playing Affinity, they're pretty much gonna hate this card. 2 mana, destroy target artifact, a flashback for green. You're basically gonna decimate their board with just top decking 1 of these. Love it. Great card. Run it. Engineered Explosives. Another really good card against Affinity and pretty much anything early aggro. Being able to sunburst this card into, basically you're probably going to hit it for 1 or 2 most of the time. Pretty big deal. If an opponent lays their hand out on turn 1 with Affinity, you're basically going to answer it with Engineer Explosives for 1 or 0, sack it off the next turn, and completely wipe their board. Fulminator Mage. This guy is brutal. Basically, 3 mana, 2/2, sacrifice him, destroy target non-basic land. Super big during the Eldrazi phase, Tron builds, just he's good in general, being able to decimate your opponent after they fetched and shocked in a land, hit him, bye-bye land. He also plays really nicely with this card, being able to fetch him back to your hand and repeat the process. This guy has went and put Kitchen Finks in the sideboard as a 4 of, more than likely just on aggro decks and things of the, I'm going to say probably mirror matches where they're going to have a lot of disruption. This guy is pretty hard to deal with. You're going to have to 2-for-1 yourself just to get rid of him in most cases. Great sideboard. Pyroclasm. Another great card for aggro. 2 damage to all creatures for 2 mana. Basically, you're probably going to turn 1, Inquisition, Thoughtseize, something along those lines. Check out what your opponent has going on. If they're basically just going to try to load up the board the next 2 turns, take a couple of beats, let them build up their board, and then just wipe them clean and start playing your own. Surgical Extraction. This card is bonkers. Basically, you can choose any card in a graveyard other than a basic land and then search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of copies. Exile them. Combo decks hate this. Tron decks hate this. It's pretty much a go-to. It also deals with being this instant speed, can deal with those pesky Emeralds on the trigger of them trying to come back. This is kind of an odd one of in the sideboard, but hey, this guy pound for pound, 5 mana, 5/3, gain 5 life when he enters. When he leaves the battlefield, you get a 3/3 token. Pretty solid. Let's check out these other sideboards. Ancient Grudge we've already went over. Anger the Gods. A little bit stronger than Pyroclasm, with 1 more damage to each creature, and if they would die, exile them. Chandra Pyromaster. Never actually played with her in Jund, even though she's hit almost $50 with her first big placing at the Pro Tour. She's just solid. 1 damage to target player, 1 damage to that. I'm getting tongue-tied here. 1 damage to target player and 1 damage to up to 1 target creature that player controls. That creature can't block this turn. Turns out when you got a board of some quite large Tarmogoyfs, pretty handy. She can also create you some card advantage off of her 0, and I don't think that her ultimate is going to do much good in this. Duress. Just some more redundancy with Inquisition and Thoughtseize. Hits a little less often with being only non-creature, non-land, but at no downside for 2 life like Thoughtseize, and if your opponent's playing much larger spells, Inquisition is probably going to whiff. This card is in for Living End. Basically, you want to get rid of someone's graveyard, this is the way to go. And also, if you can pump an extra black into it, it'll cantrip for you. Shatterstorm. Another card that Affinity just cannot deal with. And some more redundancy with some extra Thoughtseizes. This guy's went a little different. Let's see here. Some extra Abrupt Decays since he went pretty light in his main board. Ancient Grudge again. Anger the Gods. Blood Moon. This card is completely brutal. I'm surprised it actually isn't banned in Modern yet. It basically shuts down most decks that are not mono red. Jund Charm. Exile all cards from target player's graveyard. 2 damage to each creature, or 2+1/+1 counters to target creature. Pretty all around, just great card, lots of diversity. I like this being in sideboard. I usually go for Golgari Charm myself, but cannot deny this card is pound for pound, lots of variability. Night of Soul's Betrayal. If your opponent is planning on beating you down with 1/1 tokens and casting Lingering Souls all day, you might want to board a couple of these in. Pithing Needle. Another great card I run a couple of in my own board. Shutting down those pesky planeswalkers, killing your opponent's ability to use their own scavenging ooze. There's just limitless things you can do with this card. Very good, very cheap. Pick 'em up. Slaughter Games. Similar to Surgical Extraction, but it can't be countered at a higher mana cost, but card does not need to be in a graveyard. You can just name any card in their deck, look through, nab them out, exile them. Really good for combo decks picking out their key pieces. More redundancy, and a hexproof, uncounterable, just Thrun's good. Mirror match, control decks, they're going to have a really hard time if you land this guy. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech of Jund. It's personally one of my favorite builds to play, and we'll see you next time.